In this section, we'll be looking at HTML5 and CSS3. Although all the HTML that we've looked at in this course is HTML5 compatible, there are a number of specific HTML5 and CSS3 features that are worth looking at in detail in themselves. HTML5 in particular brought a new level of interactivity and power to the browser, and in this section I'm going to show you how to take advantage of that. We'll be looking at some of the ways you can use HTML5 to make your forms more powerful and user-friendly. We'll see how we can integrate video and audio very easily into our websites with HTML5. We'll look at the new canvas tag, which allows you to essentially draw onto the screen very easily. And we'll finish with a quick run through of some of the other best features of HTML5. When you're working with HTML5 and these new advanced features, it's worth being aware of which browsers can support the features that you're using. So I'd recommend using a website called caniuse.com, which has a list of all of the latest features within HTML5 and CSS3 and shows the browser support for them. So if we're going to use the canvas tag, for example, then we should be aware that we're pretty safe with the latest versions of most of the browsers. Opera Mini is going to be our only major problem, and IE8 as well is going to be an issue. So 1% of users might struggle, but that's probably worth it for the extra features that Canvas can bring. So I hope you're excited about the potential for HTML5 to enhance your sites and make them look great and be more powerful and interactive for your users. We're going to start by looking at how HTML5 can enhance forms in the next video. One of the biggest ways that HTML5 has improved the way that we can create web pages is with forms. And in this video, we'll be looking at a few of the cool HTML5 features that you can use in your sites with usually just a single line of code. So let's set ourselves up first off with a new folder. So within our Complete Web Developer course folder, I'm going to create a new one, which I'll call 10 HTML5 CSS3. And then I'll go back over to my text editor where I've still got my mobile apps page, and I'll just get rid of everything that we don't need there. And we'll treat that as our starting point. There we go. And then I'll use File, Save As, and I'll save it in our new folder, HTML5 CSS3. There it is. And then I'll open that up in Chrome. And now we're ready to go. So let's set up a simple form. We're not going to worry about Bootstrap or anything this time. Not particularly concerned about style here, it's more functionality. So let's start with our humble input element, and we'll give it a type of text. And the first thing that I'm going to show you is actually something that we've used throughout the course, but is HTML5 specific, and that is the placeholder. And you know how that works. It just means that the browser will show that text, and then when you start typing, it will disappear. So that's familiar enough, but we wouldn't have it without HTML5. I'll just put that in a paragraph tag. And then let's look at our first new feature. And the first one that I'm going to show you is autofocus. So again, we've got a simple input with a type of text, and all we have to do with autofocus is add the word autofocus to that input, and then as soon as we load the page, it will take the focus from any other element. So if you want your user to particularly start their form with a particular input, then that's what autofocus will do for you. Note that in XHTML, which is a stricter version of HTML5, you can't just use empty attributes like that. So you would have to specify autofocus is equal to autofocus, like that. And that will still work in HTML5, but in HTML5 itself, it's not as fussy. So you can get away with just putting autofocus. That's perfectly fine. So that's pretty cool. Moving swiftly on though, we can very easily with HTML5 specify that the browser should not autocomplete. So most browsers remember the content that users have typed into specific fields, but in some cases we might want to switch that off. And that's really easy to do with HTML5. We just use autocomplete is off. Now here that won't make any difference, but if you wanted to get a user's credit card number or something like that without predicting it, then you could use autocomplete is off. Note that on is the default, so we wouldn't have to use that. The next cool feature I want to show you is required. So we saw in the jQuery section how to do validation with JavaScript, and later we did it with PHP as well. But some basic validation is built in to HTML5. And one thing we can do is use the attribute required to force a certain field to be filled in. So I'll just put a submit field at the end there. And then let's have a look. If I try and submit, then it will insist that we fill out that field. A related tag that we've already seen is one with a type of email. And let's put that above the submit. So if I put some text in there that's not an email address and try and submit, or in fact I get that error first, but if I then fill in that field and submit, then it gives us a nice error message if they don't put a valid email address in. So let's just label these a little bit. So we've got a placeholder, autofocus, autocomplete, off, required, and email. All right, getting to more complex stuff, we can use a pattern to insist that an input has a certain pattern to it. So we would use that like this. So we use the pattern attribute. So if, for example, we wanted to insist that they enter a single digit, then we could use square brackets and 0 to 9. And then, as long as I validated all of those, if I put a 2-digit number in there, it says please match the correct format. And if I get it right, then it submits the form. These patterns are standard regex, or regular expressions, which again we saw in the PHP chapter. But if you want to check out some examples, there's a whole website out there called HTML5pattern.com, which gives you a bunch of examples. So for example, you could specify a username with 2 to 20 characters, a valid Twitter username, etc., etc. You get the idea. So that's a really easy way to validate certain data types without even using any JavaScript. If you thought that was cool though, wait till you see this. With HTML5, we can set up autocomplete in our forms, again, without using any JavaScript. And we do that by setting up a data list with a certain ID. So if I use my classic example, I might want to have a data list of names. And then within that data list, I would set up options, just like with drop downs, that might have a value of Rob and then a display of Rob as well. I might have Kirsten, Tommy, and Ralphie. There we go. And then I just set up my text input as usual. And I add a list to it with an ID matching the data list. That simple. So now, if I start typing there, it will predict which ones I'm looking for and even give me a little drop down of all the available ones as well. So I think that's a hugely powerful new option and in many ways preferable to a drop down because you can get to what you're wanting to enter much quicker, especially if you've got a long list of potential values. You can even add a drop down within the data list itself and then if your browser doesn't support the new data list feature, then it will show a drop-down menu there. So that's a really nice, elegant way of degrading should the autocomplete feature not be available. Another useful feature is being able to link an input to a specific form. So by default, for HTML5, if you wanted an input to be linked to the form, you would have to put it inside that form. But that's not always useful. If you're generating a table and you want a number of mini forms within that table, then quite often you'll want to put your input outside the form. But that's now easy to do with HTML5. So you can put your code outside the form and you just link it to a specific form by its ID. Simple. And then it will appear wherever you want it on the page, but when that form is submitted, then this data will be submitted with it. On a similar note, previously when a form was submitted, you could only have a single action option on the form itself. So we might have something like processform.php, but you might want to go to different locations depending on which submit button has been clicked. And you can do that very easily using form action on your submit button, and you can then just specify a different URL for that particular submit button. You can even specify a particular method for each button, although I'm not too sure why you'd want to do that. But you can have get for some buttons and post for others. The final new cool thing I want to show you with forms is how easy it is to upload multiple files with HTML5 forms. So the traditional input for files would be an input with type of file. Simple as that. And then you would choose your file in the usual way. But if you want the user to be able to select multiple files, you just add the multiple attribute to your input, and you can then choose, let's just pick 2 files using Command or Control on Windows, and then it's selected 2 files, and then both of those will be uploaded when you submit the form. And that's it. I hope you'll agree with me that all of those are very useful and save a lot of time in programming if you want to do any of this sort of validation, autocomplete, or fancy submitting. That's just the beginning of HTML5 though, and in the next video we'll be looking at how we can use HTML5 to insert audio and video. Before HTML5, the only way to play video and audio on your sites was to use some sort of a plugin. But with HTML5, adding and controlling video and audio is extremely easy. Before we can do that though, we will need to download some video and audio. So I would just do a quick Google for sample video, and I like the website samplevideos.com, which does exactly what you think it might do. And for video, I would recommend MP4. This has got the most browser support of all the file formats. So I'm going to click download for that first one, and I'm going to save it in the same folder as my main file, and I'll just call it video. And while we're here, we'll download some audio as well. Again, MP3 is the best standard to use in my opinion because it's the only one supported by all the major browsers. I'll just call that audio.mp3. Alright, so let's get rid of our lovely form code and see how we add video to our HTML page. So as I've said, it's super easy. We just use the video tag with a certain width. Let's go for 320 and a height of 240. And then all we need to do is specify a source for the video, and we do that using an src of video.mp4, and we specify the type as well. So the type here is video/mp4. You can even specify multiple sources if you want to be absolutely sure that you're maximizing browser compatibility, but with MP4 you should be pretty safe. You can also add some text which will appear if the user's browser doesn't support this type of video. I'll just put please upgrade your browser. Alright then, let's have a look. So there's the video. Unfortunately though, we can't do anything with it. That's because without specifying controls, we don't get given any controls. So let's try it now. Aha, there we go. That looks a bit better. And we can play the video right there. All the controls are going to be different from browser to browser, but usually they will have a full screen option like that, and volume controls and slider controls as well. We can also use the autoplay attribute to do what you might think, make the video autoplay. So if we were really cruel to our users, we might turn off the controls and autoplay the video. That might work quite well with a soundless video that formed the backdrop of a hero bar on your page, for example. But normally, we're going to want to give the users some controls. That's pretty much all there is to it, but we can also interact with the video using JavaScript, and I'll just show you the basics of how we might do that here. So let's add a bit of JavaScript. One thing to note in HTML5 as well is that you don't have to specify a type for your script tags anymore. I think it's generally a good idea, but it's not part of the HTML5 specification, so we can just leave it like that. So let's say we wanted our own button which started the video. So let's just get rid of autoplay for the moment. So underneath the video we might have button with an ID of play, which had the word play on it. So obviously that won't do anything at the moment. but let's write some JavaScript to get some interaction with it. So we'll use the good old getElementById to grab our play button, and we want to add an onClick to that, which is a function which will be contained here. And as usual, I'll do a quick check just to make sure everything's linked up. There we go. So how do we make the video play? It's pretty easy. We need to first give the video an ID. So I'll give it an ID of video. And then again, we use document.getElementById video. And then we just simply use play. Simple as that. So let's see it in action. There we go. So here's a quick challenge for you. Can you make it not just a play button, but a button which either plays or pauses the video, depending on whether it's currently paused or playing? Go for it. Now, you may have had to do a little bit of Googling there to figure out how to do it, but it's pretty straightforward. We do a check to see if document.getElementById video and then paused. And if that's the case, we'll play it. If it's not, then we'll pause it. So let's have a look. So play, pause, play, pause. And just to be a little bit more fancy as well, if we're making it play, then we'll set this dot inner HTML is equal to pause, and similarly here, this dot inner HTML is equal to play, just so our play button updates. Great. One more thing before we move on to audio. So that's pretty much all you need to know about including video in your websites, and you can probably guess what the process is for including audio. It works in pretty much the same way. So let's check it out. So instead of a video tag, we have an audio tag. We don't necessarily need a width and a height here. So we might just want to have an audio tag with controls. And then, as before, we specify the source. So in our case, it's going to be audio.mp3. And a small HTML5 comment here is that you no longer need the quotes around attribute values like that. I quite like putting them in though, because I think it makes things a little bit clearer. But in HTML5, you don't need them. And then you specify the type again. So this is MP3, so we use audio.mpeg. And then once again, we'll add a message to upgrade their browser if it doesn't work. And here we go. So that should play our audio. There it is. Wonderful. And note that if we take out the controls and put autoplay in there, we can again very cruelly just autoplay the sound without any way of the user stopping it. So let's not do that. That's better. And that's it. You can use exactly the same JavaScript instructions to add, play, pause, etc. But I'm sure you can figure out how to do that based on this code if you need to. So very, very simple. We just use the video tag or the audio tag with a few options to play video and audio in your websites. I hope your head is buzzing with ideas about how you might use that, but we're going to go on and see perhaps the most famous HTML5 tag, and that is canvas. Continuing our tour of HTML5 features, in this video we're going to be looking at the canvas element, which at its base level allows us to draw on the screen, but at its most advanced allows you to create complete 2D and 3D games that work right inside the browser. We're not going to go that far, but if you want to have a quick Google of HTML5 canvas games or HTML5 canvas examples, you'll see some really cool stuff. So starting at the beginning, we create a canvas with the canvas tag, as you might imagine, and then we usually give it an ID of something like my canvas, and then we're going to specify a width. Let's go for 500 and a height of, let's say, 400. There we go. Now in itself, that doesn't show us anything at all. So we might want to give it a little bit of style. For example, a border 1px solid grey, just to be sure that it's there. There it is. So to do anything with our canvas, we need JavaScript. So let's bring in a script tag, and we'll start by getting the canvas, which we'll do in the usual way, but I'll assign a variable to it so that we can access it from later on in the JavaScript much easier. So document.getElementById, my canvas, and then the first thing we need to specify is whether we're working in 2D or 3D, and we do that by creating a context, and the context is my canvas dot get context, and we want to specify 2D because we're working in 2 dimensions here. And now let's say we want to add a rectangle to this canvas. We would first specify the fill style. So we get that within the context, and that can either be a color or even a gradient or a pattern. We'll see how to do the latter later on, but for a color, I'm just going to get one from my color picker here. So let's go for a nice green and then copy that to the clipboard with the hash in front. And there we go. So that will specify the color that we're using until we change it. And then to draw our rectangle, we use the fill rect. So that will draw a filled in rectangle. And for the fill rect function, we need to specify 4 numbers. So the first 2 numbers are the coordinates of the top left of the rectangle. Now the coordinate system in our canvas starts at the top left, so this would be 0, 0, and the bottom right would then be, in my case, 500, 400, because it's 500 along and 400 down. So if we wanted to start our rectangle in the top left corner, then we would use 0, 0. And then the last 2 numbers are the width and height of the rectangle. So if we wanted to make it 100 pixels in the horizontal and 50 pixels in the vertical, then we would do it like that. Let's take a look. Super. So obviously I could change those numbers to anything I wanted. To make a rectangle anywhere on the canvas. So that's rectangles. How about lines? Lines are very easy to draw as well. We use context again, and then in this case we move to wherever we want the line to start. So let's say we want to draw a line from the bottom left of the canvas to the top right. So what are the coordinates of the bottom left of the canvas down here? All right, hope you got it. The bottom left is 0 in the x direction and 400 down. So that's 0, 400. Then we take our context again and line 2. And this is to specify where we want the line to go to. So once again, question for you. What are the coordinates of the top right of the rectangle, of the canvas, sorry? Okay, hope you got it. They are 500 along and 0 down. So 500, 0. And then finally we have to specify to actually draw the line, and we do that using context.stroke. Okay, let's have a look. There we go. So that's drawn our line from bottom left to top right. Notice that the line is not green. That's because we've set the fill style to green, but the line doesn't have a fill style. It instead has a stroke style. So if we set that, again, we could set that to anything we liked, but I'm going to choose a color. Let's have a red for this one. There we go. And that will then change the color of our line. We can also change the thickness of the line using context.line width. And we can put that equal to whatever we like. So say 20. That'll make it pretty thick. 20 pixels thick to be precise. And there we go. So a quick challenge for you then to practice this. Can you draw a 200 by 200 pixels square in the center of the canvas with a red X crisscrossing it from the top left to the bottom right and the bottom left to the top right? Go for it. Okay, hope you managed it. It's pretty straightforward. The tricky bit is just getting the maths right. So let's create a fill rectangle again. And because we want it 200 by 200 in the center here, then we need to work out what the center of the canvas is. So this is 500 pixels wide, so the center is going to be 250, half of that. And then if we want it 200 pixels wide in total, we want to go 100 that way and 100 that way. So 100 to the left of 250 is 150. And then we also want to go 100 pixels up of the center. So the height is 400, so the center is 200. So 100 pixels up from that is 100. And then we just specify the width and the height, both of which are 200. Okay, let's check that. That looks pretty good. Now let's do our line. So we'll use context.move2. And I'm going to do top left to bottom right first off. So the top left here is the same as what we had for the rectangle there. So 150, 100. Then we'll have a line 2. And we want the bottom right. So that's going to be each of these plus 200. So 350, 300. Then we'll set the stroke style. To be our color, which I'll just copy again. And finally, we'll do context.stroke to draw the line. There we go. So that's the line from top left to bottom right. We also want to do bottom left to top right. We can actually do that within the same stroke here. So we can use context.move2, and then bottom left is going to be the same as top left, but 200 down. So that's 150, 300, because we add 200 to that 100 there. and then line 2, and again that's going to be the same as the top left coordinates, but it's going to be 200 to the right. So that's 350, 150 plus 200, and then the y coordinate is the same as for the top left. All right, let's take a look. There we go. Moving swiftly on, we can also draw circles. They're pretty straightforward. So for these ones, we use context.beginPath, and then to draw our circle, we use context.arc, and then we give the coordinates of the center of the circle. So let's say we want the center of the circle to be 100, 100, so up there somewhere. Then we give the radius of the circle, which is the distance from the center to the edge. So let's say that's 50. And then to specify the amount of arc we want, we use angles, and specifically we use a measure of angles called radians. Now you're probably used to a full circle being 360 degrees. We can also break down a circle into units called radians, where instead of being 360 radians, there are 2 pi radians in a full circle. Now that might sound horrendously complicated, but it is useful in a number of situations, and it's what we need to do here. So if I want to do a full circle, I want to go from, if this is my center, I want to go round from the right all the way around from the start to the end. So the start of the circle is 0 radians, which essentially means on the right hand side there. And then remember there are 2 pi radians in a full circle. So if I want to go all the way around, I want to end my circle at 2 times pi. And to get pi in JavaScript, we use math.pi. So feel free to listen to that explanation again, or do a quick bit of online research about pi and radians. But this will get us our full circle, and I'll do another example in a moment which should clarify it a little bit as well. And then we use context.stroke, same as before, to draw the circle. There we go. So now we've got our full circle, which is going round from there all the way round. So to clarify what's going on with these angles, let's imagine that we want to draw an arc from here on the left to here at the top. So remember, this is 0 and all the way around is 2 pi. So the starting point now is going to be halfway round. So if all the way around is 2 pi, half the way round is 1 pi. So we're going to start at just math.pi. And then the finishing point is up here, which is 3/4 of the way round. So if the full circle is 2 pi, 3/4 of it is going to be 2 pi times 3/4. So I'm just going to take my 2 pi and multiply it by 3/4. And then that will give me a quarter circle from the left to the top. All right, so now we've got rectangles, we've got lines, and we've got arcs and circles. There are 2 more things I'm going to show you here, and they are gradients and text. So to add a gradient to our canvas, we create a variable called gradient. We can call it whatever we like, but gradient makes sense. And this is going to be context.createLinearGradient. And we've got x0 and y0 there, which are the coordinates of the top left of where we want our gradient to be, and x1 and y1, the bottom right of the gradient. So I'm going to use this gradient in my square. So the top left coordinates of my square are 150 and 100. And then the bottom right coordinates are 350, 300. So that's where I want my gradient to go. Now I need to specify the colors involved in the gradient. And to do that, I add color stops to my gradient. So we have gradient dot add color stop. And this is going to be the starting color, which is going to be the color here, or the color at 0. So 0 is the top left essentially, and I can specify an HTML color code, or I could just use a word description. So we're going to have white at the top left, and then at the bottom right, this has a color stop of 1. So let's point there, and let's use the green that we had before for that. And then, as you might have guessed, instead of setting a color as our fill style, we set gradient as the fill style. So then we'll have a very nice gradient from top left to bottom right. Finally then, we'll see how to add text to our canvas. And again, this is pretty straightforward. We start off by specifying a font. So we might go for something like 20 pixels Arial. And then we use fill text. And I'm just going to use my canvas. And then we specify the bottom left coordinates of the text. So if I want it somewhere around the middle at the top there, I might specify 200, 50. And then just before we run that, we'll need to set the fill style again, because at the moment we've got it on a gradient, which is only defined in that rectangle there. So we can just update it to a fill style of, to keep things simple, black. There we go. So that's pretty much as far as we're going to go with the canvas, but I've just got a quick challenge for you. Can you make it so that the My Canvas text goes from red on the left to green on the right with a gradient? Go for it. Okay, hope you got it. So we'll need to create a new gradient. I'll call it text gradient, which as before is going to be context.create linear gradient. Now we want it to start at 200, 50. And we want it to end somewhere on the right. I'll have to guess roughly where that is. I think it's probably about 300, 50 as well. And then we need to add our color stops. So text gradient, add color stop. And we want red on the left. So I'm going to go for red. And then we want yellow on the right. So we'll go for yellow there. And then we update our fill style to being text gradient. And there we go. Very stylish. All right, so there's obviously a huge amount more that you can do with Canvas. This has just been an introduction to how you can create basic shapes, gradients, and text. I do want to put that into practice though. So in the next video, we'll have a Canvas challenge in which we'll build an analog clock. Now that we're familiar with the HTML5 canvas element, we're going to be making a clock. So this will show us how far we can go with the skills that we learned in the previous video. It's actually an idea that I got from the W3 Schools website that I thought was really cool, and so this is what we're going to be making in this video. It does have some reasonably complex maths in it, so be prepared to watch my video if you haven't done maths for quite a while, because you do need to work out some angles and also lengths from, say, the center to the number 1 to make the numbers and hands appear in the right place. But other than that, all of the skills are what we covered in the previous video. So I'll give you a moment to pause the video and try and recreate what you've got in front of you here. Best of luck. Okay, hope you managed to have a good stab at that. So let's start by setting up our canvas. So I'll give it an ID of clock. and a width of 500 and a height of 500 as well. And then we'll add our scripts. Let's not forget a quick message, just in case the user is using an old browser. And then let's create our canvas variable, which is going to be document.getElementById clock, and also our context. So that's canvas.getContext 2D. I also want a variable to specify the radius of my clock, which is simply going to be half the width of the canvas. So let's use clock radius, and we'll put that equal to canvas.width divided by 2. And because I like to check these things, let's just alert the value of the radius. Yep, 250. Perfect. All right, and now let's draw the clock circle. So we'll do this using context.beginPath. Then we'll set up our arc. And this is going to have a center of clock radius, clock radius, which is the center of our canvas. A radius of clock radius. And we're going to start at 0 and go all the way around, so 2 times pi. And then we want to draw it, but this time we don't want to just have an arc, we want to fill it in. So we'll use context.fill. All right, let's have a look. There we go. That looks good. Now for the tricky part, the numbers. So we're going to do this with text. So let's use context.font. And let's try making this about 1/10 of the radius in terms of pixels. We might need to tweak that a little bit. Let's use clock radius divided by 10 and then plus pixels and Arial. And then we'll need to set the fill style to white. And the challenge here is going to be getting the positioning right. I'm going to use 2 layout instructions to make my life a little bit easier. First one is text align, which is center. So that will make the text aligned at the center of the horizontal position where I put it. And we can do the same with the vertical position using text baseline is middle. So this will essentially put the text in the center horizontally and vertically of where I put it rather than at the bottom left. And for now, we'll just start with the 12. So let's pop that in. So context.fill text 12. And we'll put it just at the center of the circle for the moment. So that's clock radius, clock radius. And there we go. Now the 12, of course, we want to appear up here. So for the 12, the x coordinate is already correct, but the y coordinate needs to be decreased by a little bit less than the clock radius. So I'm going to subtract clock radius times 0.9 from that to get it near the top. All right, now that was the easy one. The tricky one is going to be the next one, so the 1 essentially. So this is where we're going to need our maths. So let's copy what we've got so far, but this time we want the 1. Now, if you imagine a line going from the center of the circle to where we want our 1 to be, that line has a length of clock radius times 0.9, because it's a little bit less than the clock radius. And essentially we want to work out the vertical distance from the center to that point and the horizontal distance. And that's where we use sine and cos. If you manage to look those up and figure out how to use them, then congratulations. If not, don't worry about it. It's quite mathematically specific. Essentially, the up movement is going to be this length multiplied by cos of the angle. And the horizontal movement is going to be this length multiplied by the sine of the angle. So let's try and get that right. So for the horizontal, we want to add on, and I think I'll make it longer here, clock radius multiplied by, here we want math.sine of the angle, which is 2 times math.pi, which remember is all the way round, but we only want to go 1/12 of the way round, so we're going to divide that by 12. And I actually want to multiply the clock radius by 0.9 because I only want to go 9/10 of the way out to the numbers rather than to the edge. So that looks good. Looks like it's moved it along about the right amount. We now want to move it down the right amount as well. So it's actually pretty similar to before, that instead of subtracting just clock radius times 0.9, which would take it vertically up, we subtract clock radius times 0.9 times cos of the angle. So that's multiplied by math.cos 2 times math.pi divided by 12, because we're dividing the full circle into 12 equal parts. Phew! So don't worry too much if you didn't follow all the maths going on there. This is the point at which you should be able to carry on and finish the challenge, even if you're not 100% clear on how the sine and cos come into the whole thing. All right. So obviously we don't want to have 12 different lines of code to do this. We want to do this with a nice loop. So let's use a for loop, and we'll start off with I is equal to 1. And we want to keep going as long as I is less than or equal to 12. And we want to increment I by 1 each time. And then we're going to use this line of code where we're going to take, instead of 1, we want to use I. And we're also going to need to increase the angle each time. So we're just going to multiply that by I, which will take us further and further round the clock. And similarly here. Multiplied by I. All right, then, fingers crossed. Let's take a look. Wonderful. So now we have our lovely clock face. Now that all remains is the hands. And we actually don't need that 12 anymore either. So we're going to need to get the time. But fortunately, we can get that from JavaScript pretty easily. So we'll get the number of hours. And we'll do that from a new date dot get hours. We'll get minutes, which is another new date dot get minutes. And we'll get seconds as well, which will be new date get seconds. Now, seconds is pretty straightforward because it's just between 0 and 60. Minutes is also pretty straightforward because it's between 0 and 60. But hours is not quite that straightforward. And that's because not only is it in a 24-hour format, but we also need to incorporate the number of minutes in it as well, because we do want to move it around between the 3 and the 4, say, as we get closer and closer to 4 o'clock. So let's create a variable full hours. And first off, we need to get it from a 24-hour to 12-hour. Now, the easy way to do that is to take hours and use %12 to get the remainder when hours is divided by 12. And so if hours is less than 12, it will remain the same. If it's more than 12, essentially we're subtracting 12 from it to get from, say, 23 to 11. And then we need to add to that the number of minutes, which is just minutes divided by 60, because we need to get that in hours. And then for full accuracy, we should also do seconds divided by 3,600, the number of seconds in an hour. Next, we need to get the angle for each of these. So let's have a variable hours angle. This is going to be the angle of the hour hand from 12 o'clock, which is actually reasonably straightforward. We just get the number of hours, so full hours, and then multiply that by the number of angles for 1 hour. And 1 hour is 2 times math.pi, which is all the way around a circle, divided by 12, because it's a 12th of the way around the circle. Similarly, we'll do minutes angle, and that's going to be minutes times 2 times math.pi divided by 12. And seconds angle is going to be the same. So that's just seconds times 2 times pi divided by 12. And then to draw, say, the hour hand, we'll use context.move2, and then we want to start at the center of the circle, which is clock radius, comma clock radius. So halfway along, halfway down. And then we want to draw a line 2, and this is the tricky bit again. So I'll expand outwards. Essentially, we're going to want the same thing that we had here. So on the horizontal, we want exactly the same as that, except instead of moving this angle around, we want to move the hours angle around. And then for the y coordinate, we want to use again the same as before. So clock radius to get to the center minus clock radius times 0.9 times cos of the angle. So hours angle. And then we want to draw the line. So context dot stroke. And a couple of quick things there. Firstly, I think I've missed a bracket off, and we also need to set the stroke style, because otherwise it's going to be black, so we won't see it on top of the clock face. So I'll just set it to white. And one more quick change as well. I think we'll need to have a variable for the date rather than grab the hours, minutes and seconds directly from the new date function. And a small thing as well, I've forgotten the brackets after these functions. Let's pop those in. And I've just noticed there that I've got content rather than context. Not my finest hour, but there we go. Let's run it and give it a shot. There we go. That's looking good. And that is about the right time. It's 2:51 here. So a couple of things. We definitely want to make that a little bit shorter. In fact, the hour hand is usually quite a bit shorter. So let's make that about 0.6. And I think a little bit thicker as well. So we'll use context dot line width. And let's say 5. See how that looks. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Let's add in now the minute hand. So I'll use all of this code again. This time we'll make it a little bit thinner, a little bit longer, and we'll change, well, maybe 0.8 actually, and we'll change hours angle to minutes angle, and here as well. All right, let's take a look. Okay, that's looking good. And then we'll do the same for the second hand. So we'll make it a bit narrower again. And then we want seconds angle and seconds angle. And there we go. I think I'll just make the seconds angle line a little bit longer. So maybe we'll go all the way out to 0.9. Lovely. And then before we make the clock work, I think it looks a little bit ugly in the middle there. So I'm just going to add a small circle in the middle to tidy that up a touch. So let's add another path and then have an arc. And let's just try 20 pixels. And we'll need the fill style to be white at that point. So actually I can move that up here to before we draw that circle. So let's take a look. There we go. That does look a little bit tidier. I think I'll just make it a bit smaller. Maybe 10. There we go. Much better. And I've just noticed something slightly strange with our hands. They do sort of pop all over the place a little bit. And I think that's because even though there are 12 hours in a full turn, there are 60 minutes. And of course, 60 seconds. So that looks much better. Brilliant. So all that remains is to get this to update every second rather than just when the page is refreshed. But that's easily done. All we need to do is set this whole thing up as a function. So we might call it set time. And then we want that function to be called every second. So we use set interval and then set time every 1000 milliseconds. And one final change that we'll need there is to set the fill style to black just before the clock face is drawn, otherwise it will still be white from drawing the hands. Okay, let's have a look. That's looking great. Fantastic. That takes us to the end of the Canvas challenge, but now we're going to move on to just assorted HTML5 cool features that we can use in our websites before we look in a bit more detail at CSS3. In this final video in the HTML5 section, we'll be looking at just a small number of remaining cool features of HTML5 and why we might want to use them. To start off, one of the biggest philosophical changes behind HTML5 is that we're now aiming to make our HTML more human readable than it was before. And this has led to a number of changes on the styling front, for example, changing B to strong, but it's also led to some new elements, some of which we've actually seen in the Bootstrap section of the course and in WordPress as well. So one of them is the article, which is essentially just a div that's used for article content. So it would be the main content section of a blog post, for example. But then we can style it directly using article without using any classes or IDs. So something like that. Let's take a look. There we go. There are a number of other elements which are essentially just divs but renamed to make your HTML more readable, and they are header, footer, article, section, nav, and menu. Again, some of which we've seen before, but all of these are essentially divs, but we just use these names to make our HTML more standardized and readable. One small note is that Internet Explorer at the time of recording will by default give these elements a display of inline, which means they'll appear to the right of previous elements rather than a display of block, which means that they will stretch to the whole width of their container and go onto a new line. And that's normally what we want for these div-like elements. So if you're going to be using them, it's recommended to put display as block to make sure that they're displayed correctly in Internet Explorer. We can even create our own elements, which is pretty fun, using JavaScript. So we can use something like document.create element. Let's say we wanted to call our element a container. And then we could use container in our HTML as well, which is quite good fun. While we're talking about new elements, there's also a new image containing element called figure. And this is designed to help us put captions and connect those with images. So let's say we've got an image. Let's just go and find one quickly. Let's have Maggie Simpson. So we'll just view that image. There we go. Copy the URL. Great. Just make sure that's displaying properly. There we go. And while we're adding an image, it's worth stating that in HTML5, for an image to be correct HTML, it has to have an alt tag. So all images should have alt tags in HTML5. And then if we want to have our caption, we use fig caption. And then just put something like Maggie Simpson. And then if we have a look, you can see that the caption is nicely aligned to the image. Obviously, we'd probably want to style that to make it display how we want. But again, the aim is really to make our HTML readable and to see that this is definitely supposed to be a caption related to this particular image. While we're talking about new tags, this one's not exactly new, but it has been redefined, and we can now use small to display some small text. So if I wanted to quote the location of this image source, then I could do that easily using small. And the last new one I'll show you is mark, which essentially highlights your text. Let's take a look. There we go. We've seen this next one before, particularly in the mobile app section, but we can now add data attributes with anything we like. So I might want to add data description and then use baby or something like that. This will be perfectly valid HTML, and I can put whatever word I like in there. And then if I want to access that and get the value of that tag at some point, I can do that easily with JavaScript, which you'll remember I don't need the type variable in HTML5 anymore. I'll just give this an ID. So to access the data description, I use document.getElementById by ID, and then get the element by its ID, and then get attribute. And the attribute that I want to get is data description. And then for now, I could just alert that. And that should alert baby for us. There we go. I'll just comment that out for now. And now there's just two more things left I'd like to show you. The first is a new type of input called range, which is very simply a slider. You can see it down the bottom there, and we can slide from left to right to choose our value. We can specify some options as well. So we could specify what the minimum value is. So we might go for 0 there, what the maximum value is, so maybe 100. And we can also specify the step value. So we might want it to go up in tens or ones, depending on our form. And then that doesn't change the look of the slider, but it does if we change the step to something high. You'll notice that we can only then pick particular values, so it jumps up and down. And then we can get the result of that either through JavaScript using val or through our form when it's submitted via PHP. Excellent. So one more thing, and I've saved one of the best features till last, and this one is the content editable feature, which essentially makes any content on your website editable by the user. So if I just add some code here, or just some straightforward text, and we then refresh the page, as the user, I can now go in and edit that text directly. So you could use that to create a diary or interactive coding application. And one advantage over, say, text areas is that we can use this on any element type. So if we wanted to create a to-do list app, for example, we could make the UL content editable. I'll just put an example list element in there. And then if we take a look, so we can now edit the options that are there, but we can also add options of our own, and the formatting is maintained. So we're getting a new list item as we add a new item on our to-do list. So that takes us to the end of what we're going to look at from HTML5. Now it's time to look at one of the major new specifications that goes along with it, and that's CSS3. Having looked at HTML5 in some detail, we're now going to examine the new features in CSS3. CSS3 is the latest version of the Cascading Style Sheets language, and it brings a lot of new and cool features that we're going to be examining in the next few videos. So we're going to start by looking at advanced selectors and pseudo classes, which allow us to access particular elements very easily. Then we're going to look at how we can do calculations within CSS. So for example, we could change the width of one column of a page relative to the screen size without using JavaScript. Then we'll look at the more graphical sides, including gradients, shadows, transformations, and animations. And finally, we'll look at some of the new layout features specific to CSS3. To get you a little bit excited though, I thought I'd show you a few of the cool things that we can do. So we can do all sorts of fading effects and transitions using CSS3. We can do cool text shadowing like that, and even make it interactive as the user can move the light source around. We can make a cube which has text on all sides, and we can rotate around with the arrow keys. And we've got this nice cool parallax effect as well, where we can effectively have depth to our images and then animate them completely using CSS. So there's a lot of cool stuff we can do. We'll start in the next video looking at selectors. One of the most useful things that we can do with the latest versions of CSS is select elements in advanced ways. So let's just start off by some of the ways that we are used to selecting elements in CSS. So we might have an H1, a paragraph, and a link. And we would access the H1 by simply typing H1. So if we wanted that to be red, for example, we just put color red in there. Similarly, we could add a class to the paragraph tag, and then we could access that class using a period or full stop and the class name, and then apply some CSS to it. Finally, we can have an ID, and we access the ID using a hash selector and the ID name, and we might have something like font size is 200%, which makes it big. So those are the selectors that we're used to using so far, but we can do a lot more than that. So first off, let's add a div which surrounds our paragraph and our link. What if I wanted to select all of the paragraphs within that div, but not paragraphs outside it? So one way would be to give them all a certain class, but that's a little bit messy, and we don't really want to do that just so that we can select them. But we can actually select them using what's known as the descendant selector. So if we wanted to select all paragraph tags within this div, we can just use div p, and then that would select all of the paragraph tags inside the div. So we might use font weight bold for those, for example, and then you can see the ones in the div are bold, but the one outside is not. We can also select what are known as sibling elements. So if we had a certain div that had an H3 element in it, for example, and we wanted to select all of the paragraphs in the same div that have an H3 element in it, then we can use H3 and then tilde, which is the squiggly line for me, shift and then the key next to Z, and then P. And for example, we could underline all of those. And then that would select all the P's within a div with an H3 element in. But if we added another div, then it wouldn't select that one. So this is in the other div. So it is font weight bold because it's in a div and it's a paragraph tag, but it's not sharing its div with an H3, so it's not underlined. But if we put an H3 in there, then it would become underlined. So that can be a very useful way to have paragraphs on different styles depending on what other elements are in them. We might want to be, again, a bit more fussy and only select the paragraph tag following the H3 element. We might want to give that a particular styling. So let's give that a font size of 150%. So the first paragraph then is bigger, but the rest are not. We can select elements that have a certain attribute in them. So if, for example, we wanted to select all the links which had a target, which usually would mean that we'd say target is equal to underscore blank, which means it opens in a new tab. Maybe we want to make all of those yellow. Then we could do that. And then if we had another link, just put it down the bottom. That link wouldn't be selected because it doesn't have a target. We could even be super fussy. Oh, I've lost my href there. Let's say this link goes to google.com, and then we could select links that only go to google.com, like that. And maybe make them bigger for some reason. And there we go. Of course, if I change the href to down here, then that one would become bigger. And these don't necessarily need to be links either. We could use any element that has any particular attribute to select for. We could even select links which go to anywhere on google.com using star equals, which means that the href just has to contain google.com. We could even make that just Google. And that will in this case do exactly the same thing. But this would then be more general and only select links which had Google in them somewhere. We can also customize this in a number of other ways. So if I add this as a comment, if we use circumflex equals, this will look for whether the attribute begins with whatever we have in the quotes there. We can use the $ equals to check whether it ends with a particular value. We can use tilde equals to see if it has the value between two spaces. So if the attribute has multiple classes, for example, or IDs, they would be separated by spaces, and we could find them here. And finally, we can use the pipe symbol. So shift, and then for me, the key just above the right shift button, to see if it has the value separated by hyphens, i.e. the dash symbol. So if you've got a class name that's made up of a number of different names separated by hyphens, you can search for it using that. So there you go. A whole different range of ways that we can select things, which mostly have the benefit of keeping your code more simple, or your HTML more simple, and your styling separated from it. So it reduces the need for having specific classes or IDs just for styling purposes. That's just the start of our fancy selectors though. In the next video, we'll see how to use pseudo classes to select one or a number of. So you have actually seen a few pseudo classes before. Mostly we've used them when it comes to links. So for example, we've used a :hover to perhaps add underlining to a link when it's hovered over, just like that. But there's a lot more we can do than just style links. We can also style inputs when they're focused. So for example, I might change the background color to blue when my input comes under focus. Let's see how that works out. So there's my input, and clicking on it then will turn it blue. While we're on form elements, We can also style form elements on the basis of whether they're enabled or disabled. So I won't show you an example this time, but you get the idea. So normally they're faded out by the browser if they're disabled. We might want to change that in some way, and we can use this pseudo selector to select all disabled inputs and style them in some way. We can even look at checkboxes or radio elements and style them in a certain way when they're checked. So that's a way of selecting form elements based on their status, but we can also select elements based on their location. And one common way of selecting elements is using first child. So this actually replicates something that we saw in the previous video, and it enables us to select the first paragraph in each of their containing elements. So in this case, the first paragraph in each div. So if we add another color to that, let's go for that lovely aquamarine. Then only the paragraphs that are the first element will be selected. We can do the same with last child. So let's make that one bigger again. Here's a question for you. Will that match any element here in our page? The answer is yes, it will match this one because it's both the first child and the last child. So it will be bigger and aquamarine. And of course, if I move this paragraph to the end of that div, it will match that one too. The other setup here is we can look at only child, and maybe we'll make that one bold, and that one, as you can imagine, will style the elements which are the only element within their container. So in this case, once again, it's that one. Notice that the first child doesn't select this paragraph here, even though it's the first paragraph within the div, because it's not the first element within the div. So if we wanted to select the first paragraph regardless of where it was, we can use first of type. And let's underline that one. So this will then underline all three of those because they're all the first of their type in their container. So notice that selected this one as well because it's the first of its type in the body element. Even though there are paragraph tags that come before it, they're not directly inside the body, so they don't count. We can also use, as you might imagine, last of type and only of type. To select the last of each type in the container and the only of type in the container as well. I'm sure you can imagine how those work, so I'll leave that as a comment. Now here we're going to get really fancy, and we can select, for example, if we look at a table row, we could select every other table row using nth child. And the rule is, for nth child, you have to provide your rule. So now you're going to need some maths for this, I'm afraid. But if you want to select every other row, then your statement would be 2n, because you're selecting rows 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. If you wanted to select every other row starting at the first one, you could use 2n minus 1. And that would then select 1, 3, 5, etc. So let's just quickly see that in action. If we make ourselves a table, and then a table row, it's not going to be a table full of me. It's going to be my usual suspects. There we go. And then if we wanted to make every other one to have a green background, that's how we do it. There we go. So it's particularly useful for styling things like lists or tables where you want to separate out the item from the one below. There's a couple of other options here as well. You can use nth last child, and that will then count backwards. So instead of counting from the first to the last, it will count from the last back to the first. Similarly, you can use nth of type to only count the elements of that type. So for example here, if we were doing the selecting within this div, nth of type would only select the P's, whereas nth child itself looks at all of the children regardless of their type. Usually that's not an issue because we're looking at either table rows or list items or something like that, so they're not interspersed with other elements. But if they were, then you could use that instead. Okay, a few more for you. First off, we could select all the empty divs. So we might want, for example, to just hide them so that there's no styling showed if they don't have any content. We can use the not pseudo selector to select, for example, all the paragraphs that are not of a class of green. And maybe we want to make those blue. There we go. And we could use the pseudo selector on its own to select, say, everything that's not a div. Okay, your brain is probably exploding with pseudo classes right now, but I'll just show you a couple more things that we can do. And one of those is to select the first letter of each, say, paragraph. And maybe you want to make that a little bit bigger. And that will then select just the first letter. We can also use first line. And we're almost there. The last pseudo selector I want to show you is actually a pseudo element, which is essentially some content or styles that we can create at the end of an element. So for example, if we wanted the link location to appear after every link in our code, and I'll just add an href here so we get the idea. Let's use that. We can use a:after to add some content, and this could even be something like this is a link, and if we look at that, you see it's added that content there. Or we could create some dynamic content by putting attr for attribute and then href, and that will then put the actual link itself after that link. To make it make a bit more sense, you might want to put this in brackets and perhaps add a space so that it reads better. You could even style that part of it different by putting the styles in here if you want to. So I think that's probably enough for you to recall for now. It's hopefully given you an idea of all the different ways that we can select objects using pseudo selectors. You can always come back to this point as a reference. You don't need to keep all of these in your head, but it's good to know that they're available when you find yourself needing something like that while building a website. Okay, if all of that was a little bit dry for you, we're going to look at something a bit more visual now, and that is, in the previous section we saw how to do gradients using the HTML5 canvas. But if all you want is a gradient, it's actually easier to do with CSS. So in this video, I'll show you how to set up gradients in CSS, and we'll also look at the different types of shadows that we can create. So I'll start by getting rid of the code from the previous video. And then let's create a nice simple div, which will give an ID of gradient. And then we'll just select it in the usual way, and we'll start off by giving it a certain width and height. So we'll just have 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And we'll start off with a background color of blue, just to check that everything's looking good. There we go. In fact, let's make it 500 pixels. Great. So if we want a gradient that goes, for example, from white to blue, top to bottom, we just use background and then linear gradient, and then we give our two colors, so white and blue. Simple as that. And then we get our beautiful gradient, and of course we can put any sort of content on top of that as well. So that's just our background for a div. We can put whatever we like behind that. Note that I've left the background color is blue for browsers that don't support the gradient. So let's see what other options we can put in there. We can switch it to a left to right gradient by simply putting to right as our first parameter, and then it will become a left to right gradient. We can even make it a diagonal gradient by making it to bottom right. And you see my text editor is even clever enough to know what that is before we even run it in the browser. But now it's top left to bottom right. And of course, you can change these to anything you like. So if you want it to go the other way around, you could change that to top left. And then that will start with white at the bottom right and go up there. You can even have multiple colors in here. So if we wanted something that looked pretty horrendous, we could use white, red, green, and blue. And there it is. Whew, that's a bit special. We can also do radial gradients. So let's just create a new div. And this is exactly the same. So in fact, I'll just copy the width and the height down from up there. And then we just use background radial gradient. And then we might have white and blue again. We could of course use HTML color codes there as well as the color names. And then we get a gradient coming out from the middle. But there's a little challenge that's just appeared for you. So can you recreate this bottom gradient? And I'll tell you that it's green at this end and yellow at the other. Try and do it without looking at this code if possible. Go for it. All right. Hope you managed that. I'll just do it by creating an ID called challenge gradient. And then, whoops, don't forget to close it. We'll give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. And then the background is going to be a linear gradient because it's not radial here, and we want to go to the bottom left. So it's to bottom left, and we're going green to yellow. Simple as that. Refresh, and that's what the code was. So that's about it when it comes to gradients. Let's look at how we use CSS3 to apply shadows. There are two ways to apply shadows in CSS3, and that is with text and box shadows. So we'll start with some text. In fact, let's have an H2. This text will have a shadow. And then it's very simple. All we do is apply text shadow and then the offset to the right and the offset down. And that means that the shadow will be 2 pixels to the right and 2 pixels down of the original. Now that looks fairly horrendous as it is, but we could do a lot more with that. We can add a color. So let's use my favorite green. There we go. Still looks pretty horrendous, but we've got the shadow. At the moment though, you can see that the shadow is completely solid. It's essentially a copy of the original text. Generally, you're going to want a slightly blurred shadow. So let's try putting in a bit of a blur. This will give a 4 pixel blur. And there we go. You can see that looks a lot nicer than it did before. Still not necessarily beautiful with the black and green combo, but it looks a lot better than it did. We could even have invisible text. By setting the color to white and just showing the shadow. A slightly different sort of shadow effect can be achieved as a kind of a glow by essentially doing a shadow with a 0 offset. So we use 0 and 0 for the offset and then say 5 pixels red for the shadow, and then you get this sort of neon-y glow effect. You can even, if you really want to, put multiple shadows on a single element of text, and you can put them in different directions. So we might have a shadow which goes to the left and up with a blur of say 4 pixels and make it yellow. And there we go. So obviously I would never advise having that sort of a look in your websites, but you can do it if you want to. So remember to use text shadowing gracefully, and it can add a real nice subtle boost to the style of your page. More commonly used than text shadowing though is box shadowing. So this, as you might imagine, happens on divs or any kind of box shaped element. So I'll call it shadow. Then let's bring it in. So we'll set the width to 200 pixels and the height to 200 pixels. And the box shadow initially to, let's say 3 pixels, 3 pixels. There we go. I should probably give a background color to the box as well. Let's use antique white. There we go. So it doesn't look great, once again, as a completely solid shadow, but if we choose the blur, so 3px, then it looks a lot nicer. And it really does have the effect of lifting the div off the page a little bit. Notice that that's quite dark immediately around the div, so you might want to change that to grey to have something a little bit more subtle. And if you want to really bring this off the page, then you just increase the box shadow to maybe 12 pixels. 12 pixels and then perhaps 6 pixels. And there you go. You've got a much bigger shadow there. And that's pretty much it. So you now know how to add shadows to divs, how to add shadows and glow effects to text, and how to create gradients. Obviously, none of the shadows or the gradients that we've created here look particularly great, but used subtly, you really can add a bit of zip to your web pages. So use it well. We're now going to move on to look at transformations in CSS3. So now we're going to move on from shadows and gradients to transformations and animations. So this you can really use to do some pretty cool stuff. But we'll start off with something pretty simple. So let's start with a div with an ID of box. And then we'll take our box and we'll give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, a background color of red, and just for fun, we'll use the CSS property border radius of 10 pixels to give it slightly rounded corners. And then we're going to see how we can apply a number of different transformations to this box, some of which may seem pretty trivial, but when they get combined with an animation, that's when you'll see the power of them. So we apply a transformation with transform, and then a nice simple one would be translate. And we might want to move it 50 pixels to the right and 50 pixels down. And that just shifts it right and down. Now that might look pretty boring in itself, but when we combine it with a box hover pseudo class and we put the transformation in the pseudo class and we apply a transition property to the box itself, and a classic here would be 1 second and then ease in out, and we'll look at what exactly is going on there in a moment, but let's just see this in action. So now we've got no transformation, but when we hover, the box slowly moves from the animated state to its previous state. And this is the key of how we do animation with CSS transformations. So obviously the 1 second here just describes the time it takes to do the transition. The ease in out means that it starts off slowly, then gets a little bit quicker, and then slows down a bit at the end. So it just gives it a sort of slightly more bouncy feel. If you don't want that bouncy feel, then you can have a linear transition, and that will then move without changing speed from one to the other. If for some reason you want the transition to be quick at the beginning and then ease in and then a linear one after that, you can use ease in. But for the vast majority, probably ease in out is going to look the best. All right, so once you've got that figured out, it's just a matter of practicing the other types of transformation. So we can do rotations using transform rotate. So maybe we want to rotate 40 degrees. So we use 40 deg. And then that will then apply on the hover. You can, of course, apply the transformation to the box itself and just have it appear like that by default if you want to. We don't have to do animations here. It's just a bit more fun when you're practicing to use animations. We can make things bigger or smaller using transform scale. So we give the X transform, so maybe we want to double the size in the X horizontal direction, and maybe we want to quadruple the size in the vertical direction. Let's see that happen. There we go. So you can see it's keeping the center the same there, but it's stretching it out horizontally and twice as much vertically. And the last one I'll show you is a skew, where you can stretch it out different amounts in both directions. So if we try 20 degrees and 30 degrees, let's see what that looks like. Get this sort of weird stretch effect. So again, it's the sort of thing you want to use subtly. You don't want probably to have a big effect like that, but it can just give a user a nice feeling if your buttons respond to their clicks in a nice way. And the scaling can be useful as well. If you've got a lot of information on a page and the user hovers over something, you might want to make that thing a little bigger to make it easier for them to read. So those are 2D transformations, but we can even do 3D transformations. So to make this a little bit clearer, we'll put some text in there this time. And we'll have an Arial font. And we'll center horizontally. And because we're using CSS3, let's get a vertical alignment in there as well. And we can do that using display is flex to use a flex box, which we'll look at in more detail in the next video. But once we've defined the display is flex, we can use align items to center to apply a vertical centering. But if we do that, then instead of using text align is center, we'll need to use justify content center to get our horizontal centering. And of course, that should be font family, not font style. There we go. That's better. Maybe just make it a touch bigger. Great. Maybe even 200. Lovely. So let's apply a 3D transformation now. The first one we'll use will be rotate X. So this rotates around the X or horizontal axis. And let's try 180 degrees. Let's see what that looks like. So you can see we get this flip effect where it even rotates the text as well. Of course, we can do a rotate Y to rotate around the vertical axis. Like that. And a rotate Z to rotate around the imaginary axis coming out of the screen. There we go. And that's the basis of it. You can do, of course, a lot more with CSS3 transformations and animations, but that's as far as we're going to take it here. I've given several links in the document at the end of this chapter if you want to investigate more. And if you do have an arty side and want to start creating fancy animations or recreating complex logos in CSS, which is a popular pastime for many, then those links would be a good place to start. For us though, we're nearly done with CSS3. I've just got a few more things to show you, and we'll do that in the final video of this section. So moving on from fun animations and transformations, in this final video on CSS3, we're going to see how we can use CSS3 to improve our website layouts. And the first of these that we're going to look at is a multi-column layout. Now this is actually pretty easy to set up, but before CSS3 there was no easy way to get multiple columns in your pages. You had to resort to quite complex CSS or even JavaScript solutions. So let's see how easy it is to do in CSS3. So first off, let's get a reasonably chunky amount of text in our div. I'll just put a couple of line breaks in between each paragraph. There we go. And then we'll style it in the usual way. So multi-column. And then all we need to use is column count, and then however many columns you want. So call it 3. Let's take a look. And sadly it hasn't worked. That's because this is one of the CSS3 properties that's not fully supported by Chrome yet. So to get it working in Chrome, you need to add a WebKit column count as well. And then we have a look, then that works really well. And this is just a reminder, you should always check the support of these CSS3 and HTML5 methods that you're using and put in any workaround that you'll need to make sure that they work on your users' browsers. The usual one is WebKit for anything that's WebKit based. So that's Chrome, Safari and Opera. And then if you need anything custom for Firefox, that's usually Moz, short for Mozilla. So to be sure that this was going to work in all browsers, you would add those 3 instructions. You can customize this further if you like by deciding what the column gap should be. So there's a default there of around 10 pixels. But if you want to customize that, you just use column gap and then whatever you want it to be. So maybe 40 pixels. And sadly, I'm going to have to use these as well to make sure it works in all browsers, specifically the WebKit one for Chrome here. There we go. So that's increased the column gap. We can even add and style a rule between the columns, so a line. It's a bit laborious, I'm afraid, especially because we have to do it 3 times. But we use column rule style and then one of those. So I'll go for solid. And then we need to do the same thing but with WebKit and Moz in front. In fact, I'll leave those there because we're going to be doing a few of these now. So we then need column rule width. So I'll just have 1px. And you might be able to anticipate column rule color. I'll use grey. And then let's add these 2 in to maximize our compatibility, and then we just prefix the official rule with those 2. There we go. So a bit of a hassle, but we do get a nice rule down the middle. So if you're making some kind of newspaper type website, then this will be a great way to do it. Sometimes you might want an element to span certain columns. So say you've got a header. Maybe news for nerds, something like that. So to make that header span multiple columns, we use column span. And we can either put all or none or a number if we wanted to span a certain number of columns. So I'll go for all. And for this one, we only need a WebKit alternative. Moz is fine for column span. Let's take a look. There we go. So now it's spanning all the way across, even though it doesn't actually need to. And that's about it. Notice that this is different to the media queries. Oh, that's unfortunate. That's better. So Chrome is not supporting these columns particularly well here. So these will not be responsive as such, so they'll change their width, but they won't flow one underneath the other like our Bootstrap columns do. But if that's the behavior that you want, then column count it is. All right, so that's enough about columns. I mentioned earlier that we can use CSS3 to calculate values for us. And doing that is actually pretty straightforward. You may remember that when we built the code player way back in the jQuery section, we wanted to have a heading. So we could even use the new header tag. And then a div underneath that, which was the height of the screen minus the height of the heading. And we had to use some jQuery to do that but we could have done it using CSS3. So let's see how that would work. We'll start off by styling the header. So this is just going to be a width 100%, height 50 pixels, and we'll add a background color of grey. There we go. So that's where our heading might be. And while we're here, I'll just set the margin to 0 so that that goes all the way to the edge. There we go. Now then, if I want my container div to be the whole height of the page minus the 50 pixels from the top, I can do that really easily. So we use container, and again we'll set the width to 100%. We'll give it a background color of yellow, and then we would set the height to calc, and then 100% minus 50 pixels. And that will do exactly what you might think. It'll set it to 100% of the height of the screen minus 50 pixels. Now that's the basics of it, but we do need a couple more options to make it work. First off, to get this 100% to work, we need to set the position to absolute. And we also need to add a WebKit prefix to the height as well, so that everything works in Chrome. Let's take a look. There we go. So now the height of the screen is the height of our page, but we haven't had to use any JavaScript to work out what that is. And you can use any kind of calculation here. So you can multiply, plus, subtract, divide, etc. So that definitely makes your life much easier when you find yourself using JavaScript for styling. Alright, so just a couple more things left. First, I would like to show you the flexbox, which is a great way of aligning things while avoiding floats, which can get quite nasty at times. So the normal way to create a flexbox would be something like create a class of flexbox container, and then within your flexbox container you might have some more divs with a class of flexbox item or something like that. I'm just going to put a few items in there. There we go. And then we'd style those. Most importantly, with a display of flex, and also a display of WebKit flex. We don't need a Moz one here. And then you might want to set a width and a height. And I'll just set a background color here as well so we can see what's going on. Let's have aqua. So as it is, that doesn't change much compared to just a normal flexbox. We can use the settings we saw earlier to center things horizontally and vertically, which is a nice extra feature. Vertical centering in particular can be tricky without a flexbox. But more importantly, we can use flexbox item, and we might want to give that a background color of bisque. Why not? And let's give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels as well. And you can see that these are already floating to the left of each other. Make it a little bit clearer if we give them a margin. So say 10 pixels. And then if we added more of those, then they actually start to behave like columns, and they get thinner and thinner without going on to the next line. So compared to floating, where we're not necessarily sure whether one element is going to go onto the next line or not because we don't know the screen size, the flexbox is much more predictable for us. So if we change the width here to 100%, then it will stretch them out to a maximum size of their full size, but it will compress them if the page is narrower as well. Now within that we can do some pretty fancy things. So let's just add some numbers to these. So we can see which one's which. And then in our flexbox container, if we want to, we can set the flex direction to be row reverse. And we need to do the same thing as well with a WebKit in front of it, and that will essentially lay them out from right to left. We can also use a flex direction of column, like that, and that will lay them out in a column fashion, and it will try and squeeze them in vertically if it can. If I change the container height to say 500, then it will stretch them out a bit more. And we can use column reverse if we want to as well to go upwards. So the whole idea here is to get a consistent layout. Now that might not be what you're after. If you're after a responsive website, you might want a different layout for different screen sizes. But if you want to be pretty sure that your layout is going to be the same, then Flexbox is a great way to do it. If you really want your Flexbox items to wrap, we can achieve that as well using Flex Wrap. And we've got wrap, no wrap, and wrap reverse. I'm going to go for wrap, and we'll add a WebKit Flex Wrap as well. And then if they haven't got enough room, they'll wrap around more like floated items. Alright, so enough about Flexbox, onto our final bit of CSS3, and this is a small but very welcome introduction, and this is box sizing. And to remind you about the issue with box sizing, I'm going to give item 2 a cheeky bit of inline styling, where I'm going to give it a border of 5px solid grey. And that will then, as well as giving it the border, it will make it bigger than the rest, because you'll remember from the CSS section that this width doesn't include the width of the border, which in my experience is not normally the behavior that you want. But we can fix that with one line of CSS3, and that's using box sizing, and then we can specify border box, content box, or padding box. And I'm going to go for border box, and that will then include the border in the total size, which will mean that item 2 is now the same size as everything else, even though it's got a border. And that even includes any padding. So if I put padding of 10 pixels in there, it doesn't increase the size of the box, because the size of the box is inclusive of both the border and the padding. And when I discovered that, I breathed a big sigh of relief, because it does make things a lot easier when you're styling things that have varying borders and paddings. So that takes us to the end of our journey through HTML5 and CSS3. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've had a lot of ideas about how you could use some of these features in your websites. A reminder again to make sure to check the availability of the various fancy new features that you're using in the user's browsers, and where necessary to include the WebKit and Moz prefixes to make sure that you get the desired effect in every browser in which it's available. It's now time to introduce our final language of the course. It's one of my favorite programming languages and a great one for new coders to learn, and that's Python.